December 27, 1942, Port Moresby, New Guinea. The morning sun had barely broken through the tropical haze when Second Lieutenant Richard Bong climbed into the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning for his first combat mission. His hands were steady, his breathing calm, but his mind raced with thoughts that would prove prophetic. The Japanese have ruled these skies for a year. Today, that begins to change. Through the plexiglass canopy, Bong watched as 40 Japanese aircraft materialized from the clouds. Bombers, escorted by the legendary Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters that had terrorized Allied pilots across the Pacific. The odds were impossibly stacked against the 12 American P-38s scrambling to intercept. What the Japanese pilots did not know, could not have known, was that among those 12 Americans flew a farm boy from Wisconsin who would become their worst nightmare, a pilot whose name would soon be whispered with dread in Japanese briefing rooms from Rabaul to the Philippines. The mathematics of aerial warfare were about to be rewritten, not through technology alone, though the twin-engine Lightning was revolutionary, not through tactics alone, though American fighter doctrine was evolving rapidly, but through the emergence of one pilot whose combination of natural ability, analytical precision, and fearless aggression would shatter every assumption the Japanese held about American fighter pilots. Richard Bong had arrived in the Pacific Theater. The Japanese Imperial Navy Air Service would never be the same. The collapse of Japanese air superiority began not with a dramatic proclamation, but with 2 kills on that humid morning over Buna. Bong, flying with Captain Thomas Lynch and the 39th Fighter Squadron, engaged the massive Japanese formation with methodical precision. His first victim was a Zero, the supposedly invincible fighter that had swept Allied aircraft from Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. His second was a Nakajima K-43 Oscar, another feared Japanese fighter. For these 2 victories, Bong received the Silver Star, but the award citation could not capture what Japanese pilots experienced that day. Among them was Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Nakamura, whose after-action report, discovered in Japanese archives decades later, revealed the first cracks in Japanese confidence. The American twin-engine fighters attacked with coordination we had not seen before. One pilot, flying aircraft number unknown, demonstrated skills equal to our most experienced aces. He did not attempt to dogfight in the manner of previous American pilots. He used his aircraft's strengths, speed and altitude to dictate the terms of engagement. This troubled us greatly. The journey from Wisconsin farm boy to America's deadliest fighter pilot had begun years earlier, shaped by circumstances that seemed unremarkable until viewed through the lens of what was to come. Born September 24, 1920, in Superior, Wisconsin, Richard Bong was the eldest of 9 children born to Swedish immigrant Carl Bong and his wife, Dora. The family farm in Poplar offered a modest life, but one rich in the values that would define Bong's character.
German soldiers learned a bitter truth. When you saw a grasshopper overhead, you had minutes, perhaps only seconds, before American artillery turned your position into a killing ground. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer, an artillery officer who had coordinated counter-battery fire on the Eastern Front, documented his astonishment in letters discovered decades later in German military archives. I studied American artillery procedures from captured documents. Initially, I believed these documents were deception, propaganda designed to intimidate. No artillery system could perform as described. The coordination required would be impossible. Then I witnessed it myself near Salerno. An American grasshopper appeared. We tracked it, preparing to displace our guns as standard procedure. Before we could move, before we had even computed firing data for counter-battery fire, American shells were landing on our position. Not random fire, not area saturation, precise fire on each gun. They had calculated firing solutions, coordinated multiple batteries at different ranges, and delivered simultaneous fire in less time than it took our own forward observers to radio map coordinates to our fire direction center.
The secret to American artillery superiority lay not in a single innovation, but in a comprehensive system that integrated technology, training, and industrial capacity at a level Germany could never match. The foundation was the Fire Direction Center, a concept that revolutionized artillery employment. Where German artillery batteries calculated firing solutions individually, American batteries fed all data to a central fire direction center that could coordinate fire from dozens of batteries simultaneously. The FDC system depended on pre-computed firing tables. In offices across the United States, rooms full of women worked with mechanical calculators, slide rules, and logarithm tables, computing firing solutions for every conceivable combination of variables: wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, barrel wear, propellant temperature, altitude differences between gun and target. These tables, printed in books small enough to carry in a map case, allowed American fire direction officers to calculate precise firing solutions in minutes rather than hours. Hauptmann Werner Hofmann, a mathematics professor conscripted into the Wehrmacht artillery, examined captured American firing tables after the war. His analysis, preserved in German military records, revealed his stunned appreciation. These tables represent years of computational work, thousands of hours on mechanical calculators. They had computed solutions for every variable we might encounter in the field. Our own firing tables were crude by comparison, requiring extensive field calculations for each mission. The Americans had done the mathematics in advance. In the field, they simply looked up the answer. But tables alone could not explain American artillery's devastating effectiveness. The true revolution was time on target, a firing technique so advanced that few nations possessed the capability to execute it. Time on target, universally known as TOT, coordinated artillery fire so that shells from multiple batteries fired at different times based on their distance from the target arrived simultaneously within a 3-second window. The effect was catastrophic. German soldiers experienced no warning, no ranging shots, no gradual buildup of fire. One instant, silence. The next instant, dozens of shells detonating simultaneously. Troops in the open, whose survival against conventional artillery depended on dropping prone at the first explosion, had no time to react. Studies conducted after the war revealed that 66% of artillery casualties occurred in the first few seconds of a barrage. Time on target maximized casualties by eliminating all warnings. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, who survived TOT strikes during the Battle of the Bulge, wrote in his diary, discovered by American forces in a captured command post, "It is not artillery as we understand it. It is something new. You hear nothing. Then the world ends. Every shell arrives in the same second. The air bursts kill men who would survive ground bursts. The ground bursts kill men who would survive air bursts. There is no time to dive for cover, no time to reach a hole, no time even to drop flat. You are simply alive one moment and wounded or dead the next." The speed of the American artillery response shocked German commanders. German artillery, considered among the world's best, could deliver fire in 8 to 10 minutes under ideal conditions. American artillery routinely delivered accurate fire in 3 minutes.
The forward observers themselves represented another American advantage. German forward observers were artillery officers, often lacking infantry training or experience. American forward observers were specially trained personnel who understood both artillery and infantry tactics. They moved with infantry units, lived with infantry soldiers, and coordinated fire as an integrated part of combined arms operations. Moreover, American artillery observers could call upon an entire corps artillery, not just their own battalion. The system allowed a single forward observer to coordinate fire from dozens of batteries within minutes. A lieutenant calling for fire support could bring down the weight of metal equivalent to a small airstrike, delivered more accurately and more rapidly than any air support could provide. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Müller, commander of an infantry regiment destroyed near Saint-Lô in July 1944, documented this capability in his final report. A single American infantry company surrounded in a village held my entire regiment for 6 hours. Every time we attempted to assault, artillery fire drove us back, not from one battery, but from what seemed like dozens of batteries. The forward observer with that company, probably a lieutenant or captain, commanded more firepower than I could bring to bear with my entire regimental artillery. We lost 400 men attempting to overrun 120 Americans. We failed.
The artillery pieces themselves demonstrated American industrial superiority. The M2A1 105mm howitzer, the standard American light artillery piece, was a marvel of engineering and manufacturing. Rock Island Arsenal had perfected production techniques that allowed rapid manufacturing to precise tolerances. By the end of World War II, 8,536 M2A1 howitzers had been produced. Each American infantry division had 36 of these howitzers, organized into 3 battalions of 12 guns each. These battalions were fully motorized, towed by trucks or half-tracks that could move at highway speeds. Displacement from one firing position to another, an evolution that took German horse-drawn artillery 2 to 3 hours, took American motorized batteries 20 to 30 minutes. The contrast in mobility was stark. German artillery remained predominantly horse-drawn throughout the war. Despite Nazi propaganda showing mechanized panzer divisions, approximately 80% of German motive power relied on horses for transport. Germany started World War II with 514,000 horses and ended with 1,198,000 by February 1945. Each German artillery piece required 6 to 8 horses and took hours to limber, move, and unlimber. In winter conditions, movement became nearly impossible. Gefreiter Paul Richter, assigned to a German artillery battery in Normandy, kept a detailed diary that survived the war. We watched American artillery displaced during a battle. They fired their mission, then trucks appeared. Within 20 minutes, the entire battery had limbered their guns and departed. We required 2 hours minimum to perform the same evolution, and that assumed good weather and roads. In mud or under fire, we might need 4 hours. The Americans would set up at a new position and be ready to fire again before we had finished moving. We were fighting a 19th century war with horses against an enemy fighting a 20th century war with trucks. The outcome was inevitable. American 155mm howitzers provided even more devastating fire support. Each division had 12 M1 155mm howitzers in a separate battalion. These guns, firing 43-kilogram shells to ranges exceeding 14,000 meters, provided the division commander with a heavy punch capable of destroying fortifications that would survive smaller caliber fire. The 155mm was itself a triumph of engineering. Designed in the late 1930s and standardized in May 1941, combined range, accuracy, and reliability. 10,300 were produced during the war. The gun could be towed at highway speeds by a truck or half-track, allowing rapid displacement. Rate of fire was 4 rounds per minute, though well-trained crews could briefly achieve 6 rounds per minute. But even these divisional assets paled beside the artillery available at Corps and Army level. American Corps artillery typically included battalions of 155mm guns, 8-inch howitzers, and even massive 240mm howitzers. These weapons, capable of destroying any fortification, could be called upon by forward observers at battalion level. The pyramiding of firepower meant a single rifle company could, within minutes, bring down fire from divisional, corps, and even army artillery. German artillery, by contrast, was rigidly organized. Corps and Army artillery were separate commands, not available to support divisional operations without extensive coordination and approval through multiple headquarters. German infantry divisions had their own artillery, but calling fire from Corps artillery required routing requests through division to Corps, often taking hours for approval. By the time fire arrived, if it arrived at all,
American mobile warfare had moved the front line. Lieutenant Joachim Weber, a forward observer who had requested Corps artillery support during the Normandy campaign, documented his frustration. "I called for Corps artillery at 0915 hours. The enemy was massing tanks for an assault on our position. I provided exact coordinates, described the target, and explained the tactical situation. At 1330 hours, 4 hours later, I finally received fire, 3 salvos. By that time, the American tanks had completed their attack and withdrawn. Our position was overrun. I survived only by luck. The Corps artillery, which might have saved us, arrived too late to matter."
The technical sophistication of American artillery extended to the ammunition itself. While Germany struggled with propellant shortages and inconsistent shell production, American industry delivered ammunition in seemingly unlimited quantities, manufactured to precise specifications that ensured consistent performance. More significantly, the Americans deployed the variable time fuse, the VT fuse, a technological marvel that would prove decisive. The VT fuse, also called the proximity fuse, contained a miniature radar transmitter and receiver in the nose of the artillery shell. The transmitter broadcast a radio signal. When the shell approached the ground or any object, the reflected signal triggered detonation. The result was a shell that exploded at optimal height for maximum lethality, typically 10 to 20 meters above the ground. The VT fuse transformed artillery effectiveness. Conventional time fuses required calculating the precise time to target, then setting the fuse accordingly. Wind, temperature, barrel wear, all affected shell flight time. Even small errors meant shells exploding too high or burying themselves in the ground before detonation. The VT fuse eliminated these variables, guaranteeing optimal air burst regardless of conditions.
The VT fuse had first been used in combat by the USS Helena on January 5, 1943, shooting down a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal with only 2 to 3 salvos. Throughout 1943 and 1944, VT fuses proved devastatingly effective in naval anti-aircraft operations and against V-1 flying bombs over England. However, concerns about the technology falling into German hands prevented its use in ground artillery over Europe. General Dwight Eisenhower personally requested permission to employ VT fuses during the Battle of the Bulge, arguing that their effectiveness justified the security risk. The Pentagon initially refused, but Eisenhower protested vehemently. Formal authorization came between December 19 and 21, 1944, shortly after the German offensive began. This marked the first use of VT fuses against ground troops in the European theater. The decision proved correct. VT-fused shells devastated German formations caught in the open during the Ardennes offensive. Naval anti-aircraft tests had shown VT fuses were 3 to 4 times more effective than conventional fuses. Against V-1 flying bombs, VT fuses destroyed 79% of all incoming targets. The lethal fragment area was 3,000 square feet versus 60 square feet for conventional fuses. Some estimates suggested VT fuses increased artillery effectiveness by 200 to 700%. Troops who had learned to survive conventional artillery by seeking any depression in the ground discovered that VT fuses negated such cover. The shells exploded above them, showering downward deadly fragments that struck men prone in shallow holes. Oberfuhrer Hans Müller, whose diary opened this account, survived a VT fuse barrage and recorded his experience. "We had learned on the Eastern Front to go flat at the first explosion. Even shallow depressions offered protection from fragments traveling horizontally. But these shells, these demon shells as we called them, exploded above us. The fragments came down like rain. Men in foxholes, men who should have been protected, were killed by fragments that fell vertically. There was no defense except deep bunkers, and we had no time to dig deep bunkers. We simply died." The psychological impact of VT fuses compounded their physical effects. German soldiers trained to respond to artillery by seeking cover found their training irrelevant. The knowledge that no cover short of overhead protection would save them induced paralysis.
Some units refused to leave defensive positions, even under direct orders, because movement in the open meant certain death if American artillery engaged them. Hauptmann Friedrich Bauer documented a near mutiny in his unit during the final weeks of the Ardennes offensive. My company was ordered to attack an American position 300 meters away. The men refused. They had seen what American artillery did to troops in the open, especially with these new fuses that burst in air. I tried to explain that we would die anyway if we did not attack, that the Americans would eventually overrun our position. The men would not move. They preferred the possibility of capture to the certainty of death under American artillery fire. The industrial capacity that produced American artillery and ammunition in such quantities represented another dimension of superiority that German soldiers could not comprehend. Rock Island Arsenal alone produced over 10,000 105mm howitzers. Multiple factories produced 155mm howitzers and heavier weapons. Shell production reached staggering levels throughout the war.
German production, hampered by Allied bombing, resource shortages, and inefficient allocation of industrial capacity, never approached American levels. German artillery pieces were often superior in design to their American counterparts, but Germany produced them in insufficient numbers and lacked the industrial capacity to maintain production as the war continued. By 1944, German artillery batteries often operated at half strength, with guns destroyed or worn out and no replacements available. More critically, German ammunition production could not sustain intensive operations. German artillery batteries were often limited to minimal daily allowances, sometimes as few as 2 to 3 shells per gun per day. American batteries faced no such restrictions. Forward observers could call for fire freely, knowing that ammunition supply was effectively unlimited. Lieutenant Werner Vogel, a German artillery officer, documented the ammunition crisis in his war diary. We received 50 shells per gun for the entire week, 50 shells to support an infantry regiment facing continuous American attacks. I was required to justify each fire mission to the battalion, explaining why this particular target merited expenditure of irreplaceable ammunition. Meanwhile, American artillery fired thousands of shells daily, with no apparent concern for conservation. We fought a poor man's war against a rich man's enemy. The disparity in ammunition supply manifested in tactical doctrine. German artillery doctrine emphasized massed fire on high-value targets, delivered only after careful planning and approval. American doctrine emphasized responsive fire, immediately available to support infantry operations. An American infantry platoon leader could request and receive artillery support within minutes. A German platoon leader might wait hours for fire, if he received any at all. The logistics of ammunition supply further highlighted American advantages. American artillery was fully motorized, supplied by truck convoys that could deliver thousands of shells to forward positions within hours. German artillery, horse-drawn and often dependent on rail transport for long-distance movement, struggled to maintain adequate forward stocks. As Allied air power interrupted German rail networks, ammunition supply became increasingly difficult. American logistics also benefited from standardization. The M1 shell fired by 105mm howitzers used the same fuse as shells fired by 155mm howitzers and larger calibers. This standardization simplified supply, reduced inventory requirements, and ensured that fuses were always available. German ammunition production, plagued by multiple fuse designs and caliber variants, suffered chronic shortages of specific components, even when overall production remained adequate.
The superiority of American artillery created a cascading effect on German tactical options. German commanders, knowing that massing forces would draw devastating artillery fire, dispersed their units. But dispersed units lacked combat power and could be defeated piecemeal. Concentrated forces could generate combat power but became targets for American artillery. Either choice led to defeat. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's final major attack in the West, demonstrated these dynamics with brutal clarity. German planning depended on fog and overcast weather to neutralize American air power. The planners correctly assessed that American aircraft could not operate in bad weather. They failed to understand that American artillery did not require good weather. During the opening days of the offensive, German armored and infantry divisions achieved significant penetrations against surprised American forces. Over 200,000 German troops and approximately 1,000 tanks launched the initial assault on December 16, 1944. Then, American artillery found them. Lacking the mobility to rapidly displace when taken under fire, German horse-drawn artillery batteries were destroyed in place. Lacking the ammunition reserves to engage in sustained counter-battery fire, German guns fell silent while American guns continued to fire. Stabs Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, whose diary provides extensive detail on German artillery operations during the Bulge, recorded the disparity. Our battery was located in woods south of St. Vit. We had 50 shells per gun, our entire allocation for the operation. We fired a mission in support of our infantry. Within 10 minutes, American counter-battery fire destroyed 3 of our 6 guns and killed most of the horses. We attempted to displace the remaining guns, but lacked horses to move them. We abandoned the guns and withdrew on foot. This was the pattern across the entire front. Our artillery was silenced, while American artillery continued to fire without pause. At Bastogne, Belgium, American artillery ammunition was actually restricted to only 10 rounds per gun per day on December 22 due to shortages. Despite this constraint, American artillery proved decisive in breaking German attacks around the surrounded town. When the weather cleared after Christmas, supply resumed and American artillery fire intensified dramatically. During the entire Bulge campaign, 4,155 American guns fired 1,225,000 artillery rounds. German units that had penetrated 50 kilometers into American lines found themselves trapped, surrounded by American forces that could call upon unlimited artillery support once resupply resumed. Oberst-Lieutenant Heinrich Müller, whose regiment had been destroyed at St. Lo 6 months earlier, commanded a replacement regiment during the Bulge. His final report, written in a prisoner of war camp after his capture in January 1945, provides a stark assessment. We were defeated by American artillery before we were defeated by American infantry or armor. Every movement we made was observed by their aircraft and engaged by their artillery. Every concentration of forces was broken up by artillery fire before we could attack. Every defensive position was smashed by artillery fire before their infantry assaulted. We could not move, could not mass, could not defend. We simply absorbed artillery fire until we ceased to exist as an effective force. The offensive, planned to drive through to Antwerp and split Allied armies, stalled after less than a week, broken primarily by American artillery. Units that began the offensive at full strength ended it with 30 to 40% casualties, with artillery fire accounting for the majority of losses. The lessons learned by German soldiers who survived American artillery came too late to change the war's outcome. Those captured and sent to prisoner of war camps in the United States discovered that the artillery system that had destroyed their units represented just one aspect of American military capability. The industrial capacity that produced tens of thousands of artillery pieces and millions of shells was the same capacity producing tanks, aircraft, trucks, and every other implement of war in quantities that dwarfed German production.
Gefreiter Otto Schmidt, captured in Tunisian and held at a camp in Texas, wrote in a letter that passed American censors, I have seen American industry. I have watched trains carrying artillery pieces, hundreds of them, moving toward ports for shipment overseas. I have seen factories producing shells by the thousands. The Americans defeated us not through superior tactics or superior soldiers, though their tactics were good and their soldiers brave. They defeated us through sheer industrial might. They could afford to fire 100 shells where we fired one. They could afford to lose equipment and replace it within days. We could not match this, could never match this, no matter how long we fought. German prisoners of war who witnessed American artillery training exercises in the United States saw firsthand the professionalism and preparation that made the system so effective. American artillery crews trained constantly, practicing the coordination and communication that allowed time-on-target missions. Forward observers worked closely with infantry units, practicing the integration that made American combined arms operations so effective. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer, the artillery officer captured in Italy, attended lectures at a prisoner of war camp where American artillery officers explained their methods. His notes, preserved in German archives, revealed his professional admiration. They have systematized everything we did by individual skill and initiative, where we depended on talented artillery officers computing firing solutions through experience and calculation. They created tables that allow average officers to achieve the same results. Where we depended on good radio operators maintaining communication under difficult conditions, they produced radios so reliable that even minimally trained operators could maintain contact. They have taken the art of artillery and transformed it into an industrial process, repeatable and scalable. This is the secret of their success.
By early 1945, as Germany's situation became hopeless, American artillery superiority only increased. German ammunition production collapsed under Allied bombing. German artillery units lost experienced crews to casualties and received inadequate replacements. German horses, essential for moving artillery, died by the thousands from overwork, lack of fodder, and American fire. The end came in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender. In the final battles, American artillery demonstrated capabilities that seemed impossible just years earlier. Oberfuhrer Hans Möller, whose diary chronicled his experiences in the Ardennes, was captured during the collapse of the German offensive. His later diary entries, written in a prisoner of war camp, reflect a complete reversal of his earlier beliefs. We were told the Americans were inferior soldiers, that they lacked fighting spirit, that they depended on material superiority because they lacked the skill and courage of German soldiers. These were lies. American soldiers fought with courage and skill, but they also fought with overwhelming material advantages that German courage and skill could not overcome. Most significantly, they fought with an artillery system so advanced that we had no effective counter. This, more than any other factor, defeated us. For the German soldiers who faced American artillery, the experience left permanent impressions. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, who survived multiple TOT barrages during the Bulge and immigrated to the United States in the 1950s, reflected in a 1960 interview,
I've been asked what weapon I feared most during the war. Not tanks, though German tanks were inferior to late-war American tanks. Not aircraft, though American air power was overwhelming. Not even American infantry, though they fought well. The weapon I feared most, the weapon that gave me nightmares then and sometimes still does today, was American artillery. The sudden, devastating fire that arrived without warning. The knowledge that you might die without ever seeing your enemy, killed by shells fired from guns kilometers away. This was true terror. The story of German soldiers and American artillery is ultimately a story about the transformation of warfare in the industrial age. Individual courage and tactical skill remained important, but they were overshadowed by industrial production, systematic training, and organizational efficiency. The Americans had created a system that amplified the capabilities of average soldiers, making them more effective than exceptional German soldiers fighting with inferior systems and inadequate support. The artillery that broke German forces in World War II was not the product of a single innovation or a brilliant individual. It was the product of systematic analysis, industrial application, comprehensive training, and abundant resources. It represented American military power at its most effective, using industrial capacity and organizational skill to create overwhelming combat power. For the German soldiers who faced this system, the experience was transformative. They entered the war believing in German superiority. They ended the war understanding that American industrial might and organizational capability had surpassed German capabilities in every meaningful way. They had learned to fear American artillery above all other weapons, for it represented the unbridgeable gap between German methods and American power.